أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد الفاتح الخاتم وعلى آله حق قدر العظيم. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, all praises are due to the Almighty Allah, the Lord of the universe, the most beneficent, the most merciful, the sovereign of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and from you alone we implore help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you have favored, neither of those who have incurred your wrath, nor of those who have gone astray. O Allah, maintain your praise persistently upon our chief and master Muhammad, the key to that which is closed, the seal to that which is past, the upholder of the truth by means of truth, the proper guide to your straight path, and upon his family according to his eminence and his great honor. Assalamu alaikum once again. Good afternoon, everyone. I am back on my new series of lectures on the topic, the Islamic Jurisprudence series. If you can remember, in the last session, we were discussing the evolution and development of Islamic jurisprudence, right from the time when the revelation started coming down to our dear Prophet, upon whom be peace and blessings, in Mecca. We discussed generally the fundamental issues that the earlier revelations discussed in the light of the hadith reported on the authority of Aisha. In fact, it is an author that is a remark by Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, which provided the clue for us to understand the nature of the earliest revelation. Where she said, أول ما نزل من القرآن آيات من المفصل فيها ذكر الجنة والنار وليس فيها حلال أو حرام ولو نزل أول ما نزل لا تشرب الخمر لقالوا لا نترك الخمر أبدا أو كما قالت. Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, said that the first revelation that came down to the Prophet, upon him be peace and blessings, was in the form of chapters, relatively short chapters, where no mention of halal or haram was conveyed. It was only a mention of matters of theology, that is, matters relating to the hereafter, like the mention of paradise and the hellfire. And there was never a mention of anything about halal or haram. She said it was out of the divine wisdom that this is a deliberately chosen by the Almighty Allah, the manner of revelation in the first instance, that is, it was deliberately chosen by the Almighty Allah to speak to the whole world at the earliest stage by telling them about facts that they need to know, realities about the hereafter, the mention of paradise and the hellfire, angelic kingdom, prophets, about the divinity, that is the ilahiyat, about the divine attributes, the divine knowledge, the divine omnipower, and his omniscience and so on. In fact, the bottom line is that there was no mention of halal and haram. And after that, we did mention that the only mention of halal and haram, as far as the Maker revelation is concerned, was the verse that was cited in the chapter Surah Al-An'am, where the Almighty Allah said, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. قل لا أجد فيما أوحي إلي محرما على طائم يطعمه إلا أن يكون ميتة أو دما مسفوحا أو لحم خنزير فإنه رجس أو فسقا أهل لغير الله به من اضطر غير باغ ولا عاد فإن ربك غفور رحيم." صدق الله العظيم. The Almighty Allah commanded our dear Prophet, upon him be peace and blessings, to tell the whole world and the Meccan people in particular that I do not find, with regard to the revelation I received from the Almighty Allah, anything forbidden in terms of things that you may consume, with the exception of only these ones, with the following. That's illa yakuna maitatan, except if it is a dead meat. The dead meat was forbidden from the earliest revelation of the Holy Quran. That is when the Quran was revealed in its earliest stage. Allah illa yakuna maitatan aw daman, or outpouring blood. I provided an example of how an animal used to be scratched or injured, so that the outpouring blood coming out from its bleeding will be taken and roasted and then devoured by the Meccan pagans. That's how they do whenever they are on a journey. When they felt hungry and they run out of food stuff, so what they do is to cause some injury to any of their animals, so that the outpouring blood will be taken, roasted, and devoured, so as to sustain themselves. You know, Islam will never condone such kind of things. That's why awdaman masfuhan, awlahama khinzirin, or the flesh of swine, lama khinzirin, فَإِنَّهُ رِجِسٌ. All these are considered filthy as far as the Almighty Allah is concerned. أَوْ فِسْقًا أُحِلَّ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ بِهِ, or an animal slaughtered in the name of anything other than the Almighty Allah. That is an animal slaughtered for an idol, so the meat of that animal is forbidden. أو فسقا أهل لغير الله به فمن اضطر غير باغ ولا عاد فإن ربك غفور رحيم. But for those that are pressed by extreme circumstances of necessity to eat for their survival, to eat these forbidden things for them to survive when they are facing a real threat to their mortality, that is, they are going to be killed by hunger. So that means that if they are facing a mortal threat, they are allowed to consume so as to sustain themselves. For those that are not transgressors, those that are not wrongdoers, bargain, anyone that is not a wrongdoing person, wala adin, I said a transgressing servant, someone that naturally used to transgress the bounds set by the Almighty Allah, can never enjoy this exception. This exception is only meant for those who are obedient and law-abiding to the Almighty Allah. And when they are pushed by circumstances of necessity to eat the forbidden items, the forbidden things, then they are pardoned. They are allowed. غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ. Those that are not wrongdoers and they are not transgressors. then فَإِنَّ رَبَّكَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. Your Lord is the most forgiving and the most merciful. In fact, Islamic jurists are almost unanimous that those who find themselves in such critical situation are allowed to carry along. After having eaten, they are allowed to carry along the forbidden meat, so that when they get angry, when they get hungry, before they arrive to their destination, when they feel hungry, they can still take out of this, they can eat it until when they reach a safer place where they can find things that are lawful for them to consume, halal food, then they can dispose of the forbidden meat. And that is it. So this was the only enactment that can be seen in the verses of Meccan revelation. Otherwise, about 2/3 of the entire revelation consisted of discussions regarding the hereafter, the angelic kingdom, the al-qada wal-qadr, the paradise, the hellfire, the reward for the believers, the requital for the unbelievers, and of course about the divine qualities, the divine attributes, the divine names, the divine actions, and also logical discussions that are meant to engage the Meccan pagans so as to convince them of the futility of polytheism and idol worshipping. In fact, the Almighty Allah used the verses of Meccan origin to demystify the idol worshipping, for them to see how useless is their creed, and for them to have a thing to know that their creator created them for a purpose. So as far as the evolution and the development of Islamic jurisprudence is concerned, there is very little legislative verses or verses of legislative relevance during the Meccan period until after the migration of the Prophet ﷺ. Despite the fact that what is of great importance for us to understand here is that while certain revelation will take place while the Prophet was still in Mecca, such revelations, the enactments they convey are meant to come to effect much, much later after the migration. Take, for example, verses concerning the third pillar of Islam, that is zakah. We all know that the pillar of zakah is the third pillar of the 5 pillars of Islam. There are quite a number of verses in the chapters of Meccan origin that discuss this pillar. For example, in the chapter well expounded, also to Fussilat, the Almighty Allah said, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Allazina la yu'tuna zakata wa hum bil akhirati hum kafirun. Those who refuse to pay out zakah because they don't believe in the hereafter, or who are going to be raised back to life on the day of resurrection as unbelievers, for the fact that they refuse to abide by the divine injunction of paying zakah. You can see the verse was revealed in Mecca. And there are co-verses to this one, such as the statement of Allah, الذي يؤتي ماله يتزكى وما لأحد عنده من نعمة تجزى إلا ابتغاء وجه ربي الأعلى ولسوف يرضى. صدق الله العظيم. The Almighty Allah praised His servant. Scholars of Tafsir reach consensus that these verses were making reference to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq when he was spending his fortunes in order to redeem and set free the weak believers that were being persecuted by the Meccan pagans, such as Bilal ibn Rabah, such as Khabbab, and so on and so forth. And the Almighty Allah says, Allazi yu'ti malahu yatazakka. In praising Abu Bakr, he said, he who gives out his money in the form of zakah, so he gives out his money for the purpose of purification, yatazakka, because he wanted to purify himself as well as his wealth. وَمَا لِأَحَدٍ إِنْدَهُ مِنْ نِعْمَةٍ تُجْزَى. In fact, the beneficiaries of his generosity, he expected nothing whatsoever from the beneficiaries of his generosity. Or rather, they did not do him any favor in the past that he wanted to reward them by spending his fortunes on them. إِلَّا ابْتِغَاءَ وَجْهِ رَبِّهِ الْأَعْلَى, except for the purpose of seeking the pleasure of his Lord, that is the great pleasure of his Lord. Or rather, wanted to seek the pleasure of his sublime Lord, Rabbi al-A'la, the supreme Lord, Rabbi al-A'la. وَلَسَوْفَ يَرْضَى. The Almighty Allah promised him what he wanted. Certainly, he will come to be pleased by his Lord as he wished. وَلَسَوْفَ يَرْضَى. So you can see all these verses were sent down to our dear Prophet during his stay in Mecca, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And as at that time, zakah was not considered compulsory, nor was it formally collected by our dear Prophet from anyone as of the time this revelation took place. But you can see the connection between those verses and the third pillar of Islam. It was 2 years after the migration that zakah was formally declared as compulsory. So we have such kind of verses in the Holy Book that will convey ordinances and enactments that are meant to come to force years later. They were not meant to come into immediate effect. They were meant to come into effect years later. If we were to pick an example in our contemporary life, for example, the House of Legislature, for example, might enact a law, and that law will be specified that it will come. Now the law is enacted this year, this month, for example, but it will come to force, that it will come into effect on the 1st January 2026, for example. This is quite common. So this also happens with regard to the Islamic Legislative Code. It happened where verses of legislative importance, of legislative verses rather, would be revealed. We call them law-giving verses. Will be revealed in the chapters of Mecca, for example. Yet, they will come into effect only after the migration. and vice versa. You may also have certain enactments not revealed, that is, certain laws were enacted during the stay of the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca. But the legislative verses will be revealed much, much later after the migration. For example, the performance of ablution. We know ablution as part of ibadat or devotion. Its ablution was made obligatory the day people started praying. That very day, no prayer had ever been conducted without ablution, ever since our dear prophet was sent. Even the prayers that were being performed prior to his historic night journey, where he was given the 5 daily prayers, those prayers used to be performed with ablution. For example, the prayers mentioned in the chapter Al-Muzammil, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Ya ayyuhal muzammil, qumil layla illa qalilan, nisfahu, aw unqus minhu qalilan, aw zid alayhi wa rattilil Qur'ana tartila. O he who is wrapped in a garment, rise up and pray for the whole night, with the exception of some few hours. Illa qalilan, kanu qalilan min al-layli ma yahja'un, wa bil ashari hum yastaghfirun. Illa qalilan. Rise up, and that is, stand up and pray for the whole night. Qumil layla illa qalilan, except for a very few hours within which that you can take some rest. Nisfahu, or half of the night, aw unqus minhu qalila, or you add some more to the half, or that is, you reduce a little from the half, that is 1/3 of the night. Aw unqus minhu qalila, aw zid alay, or a little more. In all cases, warattilil Qur'ana tartila. You should engage in the recitation of the Holy Quran throughout the prayers. So this divine commandment was part of the earliest revelation. Scholars said it came only next to the first revelation of Surah of Iqra bismi rabbikal ladzi khalaq. Anyway, the Prophet complied, peace and blessing be upon him. In fact, the concluding verses of the same chapter narrated how the Prophet complied with this order by saying, Inna rabbaka ya'lam annaka taqum adna min thulutha al-layli wa nisfihi wa thuluthihi wa ta'ifatun min allazina ma'ak sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Wallahu yuqaddiru al-layla wan-nahara alima an lan tuhsuhu fataba alaykum faqra'u ma tayassara min al-Qur'an. The Almighty Allah said that certainly your Lord is very much aware annaka taqum, that you make it a habit, you rise up in the night, that is, every night you wake up and perform these night prayers. Adna means lady, close to 2/3 of the night. You spend close to 2/3 of the night praying. When it's free, or half of the night, was see sometimes 1/3 of the night. In fact, we know that you are not the only one. And a band of those who believe in you, who are with you among the believers, also join you in these prayers. Wallahu yuqaddiru al-layla wan-nahara alima an lan tuhsuhu fataba alaykum. Certainly, the Almighty Allah is the one that measures up the hours of the night as well as the hours of the day. And he knows that alima allan tusu, you as human beings, that is the followers of the Prophet, you can't stand this for long. Allan tusu. Therefore, fataba alaykum fakra'u ma tayassara. Therefore, he relieved you of this. That is how the Muslim Ummah was relieved of a possible obligatory enactment. That is an enactment that will provide for obligatory night prayers. That's how we were spared. And we thank the Almighty Allah. Otherwise, it would have been obligatory for us to spend the whole night praying. Fataba alaykum. He relieved you of that. Therefore, fakra'u ma tayassara min al-Quran. Continue reciting what you can out of the verses of the Holy Quran. So that is that. So this is enough to tell us, but for the Prophet, this remained obligatory for him to pray in the night up to the end of his life. Because another verse in relation to this one is the one in the chapter, Surah Al-Isra, or the night journey, where the Almighty Allah said, A'udhu billahi min shaitanir rajim, wa min al-layli fatahajjad bihi nafilatan lak. Asa an yab'athaka rabbuka maqaman mahmuda. O Prophet of God, for during the hours of the night, that's every night, you are expected to rise up and pray. That is, and perform the night prayers. Nafilatan lak. This is a divine grace for you. That is the Almighty Allah choose you with this. Asa an yab'athaka rabbuka maqaman mahmuda. Certainly, the Almighty Allah may choose you for the position of gratitude. On the day of resurrection, all the kingdom of creation will turn to you in gratitude and appreciation. Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. I'm going to stop here, inshallah. When we come back in the next session, I'm going to continue exactly where I stopped. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, al-Fatih lima ughliq, wal-Khatim lima sabaq, nasir al-haqq bil-haqq, wal-hadi ila siratika al-mustaqim, wa ala alihi haqqa qadrihi min daril azim. Subhana rabbika bi izzati amma yasifun, salamun ala al-mursalin, walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum.